The bomber was dying. 30,000 feet over the English Channel, the flying fortress wasn't flying anymore. It was crawling through the air, shuddering with every gust of wind. 2 engines were gone, one feathered, one coughing smoke. The sky around her glowed with tracer fire and fragments of burning aluminum. Inside, the waste compartment was chaos. Oxygen masks fogged from heavy breathing. Wind screamed through bullet holes as the fuselage trembled. Staff Sergeant Frank Dillard, waist gunner, knelt beside the torn skin of the aircraft, staring at a jagged hole the size of a fist, just inches from where he stood moments ago. He pressed his hand against the improvised armor curtain he'd built, a patchwork of layered metal scraps and leather, bolted where official armor never reached. The bullets had hit it square, flattening harmlessly against his illegal invention. The rest of the plane was shredded, but that section had held. "Waist to pilot. How bad are we hit?" Dillard's voice rasped through the intercom. The reply came broken through static. "Too many holes to count. Hang on, boys, we're heading home if the Lord lets us." Frank looked out the open hatch. The formation that had left England that morning, 12 silver B-17s, was now 5. The rest were smoke, debris, or memory. He pulled the charging handle on his twin 50s, ready for another wave of fighters. Nothing. The sky was empty now, only silence and the hum of damaged engines. Minutes felt like hours. Then, at last, coastline. The chalk cliffs of Dover appeared through the haze like ghosts. The battered bomber limped across, trailing smoke and oil. When they touched down, the left landing gear collapsed. The aircraft screeched across the tarmac, sparks flying. Crewmen jumped clear. Dillard crawled out of the hatch, covered in grime and blood. His eyes went to the armor panel, the one thing that hadn't failed. He didn't have time to think before a clipboard slammed down in front of him. A major from maintenance barked, "Who authorized you to modify this aircraft?" Dillard blinked. "Sir?" The major pointed to the welded patchwork. "That's not Army issue. You touch government property again without approval, and you'll be grounded, or worse." Dillard's jaw tightened. He wiped the soot from his face, still shaking from adrenaline. "With respect, sir, if I hadn't, you'd be writing 6 letters to 6 families tonight." The officer glared but said nothing. He turned and walked away, muttering something about cowboys with tools. Dillard just stared after him. Around the runway, other crews were unloading stretchers, men who hadn't been so lucky. The medics' white coats glowed red under the floodlights. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed the sky. Frank Dillard sat on the wing, helmet off, breathing in the metallic smell of oil and blood. His hands shook, not from fear, but from realization. The section he'd reinforced was the only one that held. His idea had worked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flattened piece of metal, a bullet crushed against his improvised armor. He turned it in the light and whispered, "Guess the manual didn't cover this part." Later, in the quiet of the barracks, he wrote one line in his logbook. "We flew home on metal they told us not to touch." He didn't know it yet, but that single act of defiance would ripple through the air war, changing how bombers survived, how gunners fought, and how the myth of the flying fortress was finally earned. Because sometimes survival doesn't come from orders. It comes from men who refuse to die by the book. They called it the flying fortress. A machine so tough, the propaganda posters said, it could fly home on one wing. Newspapers in America printed stories of B-17s limping back from missions with holes the size of doors, and every headline told the same lie: invincible. Frank Dillard believed it too. Like every young man in 1943, he'd seen the posters, an eagle's silhouette over a fortress of steel, bristling with guns, defying gravity and death. The recruiters called it the safest seat in the sky. That's what he told his mother when he left home in Indiana. "Don't worry, Ma. It's called the Flying Fortress for a reason." But the myth died the first time he looked out a waist gun window over Bremen. It was his 3rd mission. The sky was clear. The target, an aircraft factory, was visible even before the flak started. Black puffs exploded all around them, bursting like ink in water. The bomber shook violently, and the smell of burned cordite filled the cabin. Then came the fighters. FW-190s and BF-109s diving from the sun, cannon shells streaking past. The sound wasn't thunder. It was sharper, like 1,000 hammers breaking glass. "Tail gunners hit," someone shouted. "Left waist gun jammed." Frank swung his twin 50s into position, firing short bursts. The brass casings clattered under his boots, bouncing around the oxygen tanks. He saw a German fighter flash by, so close he could see the pilot's goggles, and then it was gone, rolling through smoke. When the fight ended, the fortress limped home on 2 engines. Inside, it looked like a butcher shop. Blood streaked the walls, wires hung like veins. The radio operator was gone, vaporized by a direct hit. That night, Dillard sat on the wing, staring at the holes in the fuselage. The armor he had trusted was paper-thin. One hit from a 20-millimeter cannon, and the fortress became a coffin. The next morning, he overheard an officer telling a reporter, "She came home strong. The boys say she can take anything." Frank turned away in disgust. Strong? He'd spent the night scraping blood off the deck plates. In the mess hall, another gunner joked, "You know why they call it a fortress? Because you die inside it." The laughter that followed was bitter, exhausted. Frank began to see through the illusion. The B-17 was powerful, yes. Rugged, yes. But invincible? Not even close. Every crewman knew that once you crossed the coast of France, you had a 50-50 chance of coming back. That's when he started writing notes in his flight log, not about kills or missions, but about weak spots. He drew small diagrams of the fuselage, circling the areas where holes appeared again and again. The waist section, the oxygen lines, the ammo chutes. He began asking himself questions the manuals didn't. Why did the armor stop above the hip? Why was the oxygen tank exposed? Why did they armor the cockpit but leave the gunner's ribs open to the sky? Because, a crew chief told him once, you're replaceable. The plane isn't. Frank didn't argue, but he never forgot those words. The next time he climbed aboard, he ran his hand along the fuselage. The metal felt thin, almost fragile. He whispered under his breath, "You better hold, girl." Above him, the engines roared to life. Below him, the ground crew saluted. And as the flying fortress rolled down the runway, Frank Dillard realized that survival in the sky had nothing to do with slogans. It was math. Cold, brutal, unforgiving math. And if the Army wasn't going to change that math, maybe he would. Numbers don't lie. They never did. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had learned what every crewman eventually learned. The sky over Europe was an equation written in blood. The math was simple, brutal, and cold. 10 B-17s took off. 8 crossed the coast. 6 reached the target. 4 made it home. Every mission report carried the same silent calculation. How many would return breathing? Frank Dillard started tracking it in his notebook. 36 launched, 28 returned, 12 wounded, 9 dead, 2 missing. At first, it was just a way to pass the time. Then it became something darker, a kind of ritual, proof that survival wasn't luck. It was probability. The statistics were staggering. In 1943 alone, bomber losses over Germany reached 26,000 men, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. Every single B-17 lost meant 10 men gone. 10 names. 10 families getting telegrams that began with the same cruel words. The Secretary of War regrets to inform you. Dillard couldn't stop thinking about it. If the plane was supposed to be a fortress, why were so many dying? The answer lay in the numbers. Each B-17 mission consumed 2,000 gallons of fuel, 4,500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and more courage than a man could measure. But courage didn't stop bullets. The Luftwaffe had mastered interception science. Jagdgeschwader 26, Gullen's own wing, could put 50 fighters in the air within minutes. They attacked in perfect rhythm, head-on passes, corkscrew climbs, then diving through the formation with cannons blazing. "Shoot one down," Dillard wrote, "and 3 more appear." The waist gunners had it worst. They stood exposed in open sections of the fuselage, the thin aluminum skin barely thicker than a coin. When a fighter came from below, it was like standing inside a drum being shredded by knives. One after another, the veteran gunners disappeared, burned, frozen, torn apart. And replacements arrived fresh from training schools in the States, still believing the fortress myth. Frank watched them board the planes, faces pale under their helmets. They smiled nervously, as if the act itself could protect them. He wanted to say something honest. But what could he tell them? That armor doesn't matter if it's in the wrong place? That the manual was written by men who never flew under fire? Instead, he said the only thing that felt true. Stay low, keep shooting, and don't stop breathing until we land. It wasn't enough. Back at base, he started marking diagrams, red circles where bullet holes clustered on returning aircraft. After 10 missions, a pattern emerged. Waist sections, always the waist sections. The crewmen there were taking the worst of it. He took his sketches to a maintenance officer, suggesting that the armor be extended lower, closer to the oxygen tanks and ammo belts. The officer glanced at the paper, unimpressed. "That's not standard issue. You want to change the design, write to Boeing." Frank folded the paper silently. Later that night, he sat in his bunk, staring at the hole in the wall above his bed, a dent from a stray wrench thrown in frustration. He muttered, "If I wait for permission, I'll be dead before the ink dries." He looked at the numbers again, the math that never lied. There had to be a way to bend those odds. And that's when it started, the idea that would change everything. It wouldn't come from an engineer. It wouldn't come from a general. It would come from a single waist gunner who refused to die according to regulation. Frank Dillard learned to stop trusting stories and start trusting numbers. Every time a bomber returned, he walked the line on the tarmac, clipboard in hand, studying where the holes were. Not for official records, those belonged to the engineers, but for himself. Because in the air, the only statistics that mattered were the ones that kept you breathing. The results were horrifying. 60% of hits struck the midsection of the B-17, right where the waist gunners stood. 70% of fatal injuries came from shrapnel tearing through unarmored aluminum. 50% of oxygen fires started when cannon shells punctured the tanks near the waist. The data didn't lie. The flying fortress was weakest where its defenders stood guard. Frank wrote it all down in the small green logbook he carried everywhere. Armor plate, insufficient. Fuel lines, exposed. Ammo belts, vulnerable. Human life expectancy in the waist, 11 missions. He flipped through his notes one night after another friend, Tommy Greer, 21 years old from Kansas City, was buried in a simple pine box behind the airfield. He'd taken a cannon shell to the hip. No armor had stopped it. Dillard ran his fingers over the torn pages and whispered, "The plane's a fortress, but we're the walls." Back in the States, the newspapers told a different story. The War Department released cheerful statistics. Bomber Command achieves 92% target accuracy. Losses within acceptable range. B-17s prove nearly indestructible under fire. Frank laughed bitterly. "Nearly indestructible," he muttered, watching ground crews hose blood out of the waist compartment. One day, while counting the hits on a returning bomber, a new lieutenant walked up with a grin. "You gunners sure are lucky. These things can take anything." Frank stared at him. "You ever been inside one at 20,000 feet with your best friend's blood freezing on your gloves?" The lieutenant walked away, red-faced. But the truth was worse than arrogance. It was math. In 1943, bomber crews faced a 26% chance of death per mission. That meant that after 25 missions, the standard tour, your survival odds were less than 1 in 5. The numbers haunted him. The Army called it courage. Frank called it suicide by arithmetic. Everywhere he looked, he saw statistics carved into men's faces. The pilot who trembled lighting a cigarette after every landing. The ball turret gunner who slept with his oxygen mask still on. The radio operator who kept writing letters to a fiancée he'd never see again. Frank began to look for solutions. He studied the damage reports, memorizing where armor ended and soft aluminum began. He collected scraps of steel from the maintenance yard, cut-offs from engine cowls, pieces of wing spars, anything that could stop a 20-millimeter round. He started making sketches of his own, a patchwork curtain of overlapping plates, shaped to protect the waist section without adding too much weight. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't regulation, but it might work. His crew chief laughed when he showed the design. "You can't just bolt junk to a government plane, Frank." He smiled grimly. "Watch me." That night, while most of the base slept, Frank and a mechanic named Rudy snuck into the hangar. They welded, hammered, and riveted the crude armor into place. By dawn, it looked like a madman's invention, uneven, scarred, but solid. When the crew saw it the next morning, the pilot shook his head. "You'll catch hell for this," Frank just grinned. "If it works, hell can wait." They flew that mission over Kiel, and the armor took the hit that should have killed him. The numbers that once defined death were about to define survival. The morning of the Kiel mission began like all others. Coffee so strong it peeled paint, the metallic smell of oil and gunpowder hanging in the cold English air. But to Frank Dillard, it felt different. For the first time in months, he wasn't climbing aboard a death trap. He was climbing into something he'd helped make safer. The crew called it Frank's Folly. The waist section of their B-17 Lucky Lady looked more like a blacksmith's experiment than a government aircraft. Sheets of scavenged steel, some curved from old engine cowls, were riveted over the vulnerable aluminum ribs. They weren't pretty, but they were solid. Before takeoff, the crew chief barked, "That junk's not on the maintenance logs. You're going to have the colonel breathing down your neck, Dillard." Frank only replied, "Better him than a 20-millimeter shell." As Lucky Lady thundered down the runway, the vibration rattled the new plates like a bag of tin cans. The pilot, Lieutenant Harris, called back over the intercom. "Frank, if that contraption falls apart mid-air, I'm feeding you to the flak gunners myself." "Roger that," Frank answered. "If it falls apart, you won't have to." By the time they reached the German coast, the sky was a boiling cauldron of black smoke and flashing bursts. The formation tightened instinctively, 50 bombers, each trying to hide in the shadow of the others. Then came the fighters. "Tally-ho! Bandits! 11 o'clock high!" Frank swung his twin 50s into position, scanning the sky. 3 4x190s dove straight at them, their cannons spitting fire. The first shells tore through the fuselage just ahead of his position. 1 hit, 2, then 3. Sparks showered his boots, and smoke filled the air. But this time the sound was different. Instead of the shriek of ripping metal, he heard dull, heavy thuds. The armor plates held. The intercom erupted with shouts. "Waist section, you hit?" Frank coughed through the smoke. "Still breathing." He glanced down. The steel plates were scorched, dented, but unbroken. The spot where Tommy Greer had died 2 weeks earlier was now a cratered patch of blackened steel. He leaned out the gun port, firing short, controlled bursts. A German fighter flashed past, trailing smoke. "Splash 1 bandit!" For the next 15 minutes, the world became a blur of tracer fire, smoke, and screaming engines. The B-17 shuddered as flak tore chunks out of her tail. A cannon shell exploded near the right waist gunner's window, but the armor deflected the blast. The intercom crackled again. "Frank, what the hell did you build back there?" "Insurance policy," he shouted back. When they finally dropped their bombs and turned home, the crew was stunned to realize something miraculous. No casualties. Not a single man hurt. Back at base, the mechanics swarmed the plane. They ran their hands over the blackened steel, whistling softly. The armor was pitted with craters, some deep enough to hold a fist, but none had penetrated. The squadron commander stormed over. "Who authorized this modification?" Frank hesitated. "Nobody, sir." "Nobody?" The officer's voice was sharp. "You mean you broke regs, tampered with Army property, and risked the entire plane?" "Yes, sir." The commander glared for a moment, then softened. "Well, damn it, son. Do it again." Word spread fast. Within a week, mechanics across the base were copying Dillard's design. The engineers eventually gave it a name: Field Retrofit D-Model Reinforcement. The men called it something else: Dillard's armor. It wasn't perfect. It added weight. It rattled like hell. But it saved lives. And for the first time since he'd joined the war, Frank Dillard didn't feel like a passenger in a flying coffin. He'd beaten the math, at least for now. For the first time in months, the barracks were loud for a good reason. The men of the 351st Bomb Group toasted mugs of bitter coffee to Dillard's armor. Nobody had died on the Kiel mission, and in a war where survival itself was a miracle, that made Frank Dillard a legend. But fame in the Army Air Forces was a double-edged propeller. Within days, paperwork caught up to him. The squadron commander called him into his office. The desk was neat, the blinds drawn. A faint smell of pipe smoke filled the air. "Sit down, Dillard." Frank sat, cap in his hands. The commander flipped through a file, then looked up. "You realize you violated at least 6 maintenance protocols, right?" "Yes, sir." "You modified an aircraft without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You risked a 10-man crew." "Yes, sir." The officer closed the file slowly. "And you saved all 10. Silence hung in the air. The commander finally leaned back. "Command doesn't like cowboys, Dillard. They like checklists. But I like results." He stood and extended his hand. "Keep doing what you're doing. Just don't let Washington find out yet." Frank left the office in a daze. Outside, the sun was rising over the airfield, streaking gold across the battered bombers. He'd broken the rules, and for once, it had saved lives instead of costing them. Within weeks, his crude design became the talk of the base. Mechanics began welding armor scraps to other B-17s. Each plane was different, some neat, some messy, but all better protected. The brass noticed. Engineers from Wright Field flew in to inspect the modifications. They photographed, measured, and took notes. One of them, a man with horn-rimmed glasses, asked Frank, "How did you calculate the angles for deflection?" "I didn't," Frank replied. "I just put steel where blood used to be." The engineer smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's better than math." But not everyone was impressed. A major from supply chewed him out on the flight line. "You can't scavenge aircraft parts like scrap metal. These planes are government property." Frank stared at him, jaw tight. "So are the men flying them." The argument spread through the base like wildfire. Some officers saw him as a hero, others as a reckless mechanic who'd opened Pandora's toolbox. The War Department eventually sent a memo. "Unauthorized modifications are prohibited. Deviations from standard specifications will result in disciplinary action." Frank pinned it to the bulletin board under a headline that read, "Regulations don't stop bullets." That night, he found Rudy, the mechanic who'd helped him weld the first plates, smoking behind the hangar. "We did good, didn't we?" Rudy asked. Frank nodded. "Yeah, but they'll bury it in paperwork before it ever reaches the factories." Rudy blew out smoke. "Doesn't matter, the men talk, the idea's out there. Can't shoot that down." He was right. Across England, field crews began improvising armor, some using steel, others sandbags, even spare ammo boxes. What started as one man's illegal fix became a movement. One mission after another, the numbers shifted. Survival rates improved. Crews came home that shouldn't have. Frank stopped tracking deaths in his notebook. He started tracking lives saved instead. Then came the letter, from a captain he'd never met. It read, Your field fix saved my crew over Hanover. We took 3 hits right where your plates should have been. They held. You may never know how many men owe you their lives, but I'm one of them." Frank read it twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his flight jacket. That night, as he looked at the row of B-17s gleaming under floodlights, he finally smiled. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was just a gunner who'd broken the rules to keep his friends alive. And in a war built on machinery and orders, that small act of rebellion had made the Flying Fortress truly worthy of its name. April 8th, 1944. The target was Augsburg, a massive ball-bearing factory buried deep in Germany, defended by flak batteries so thick they painted the sky black. Every man on the base knew it was suicide. The Luftwaffe had regrouped, and radar showed over 100 fighters waiting to intercept. Frank Dillard strapped into his waist gun position aboard Lucky Lady and adjusted his headset. The patched armor glinted faintly in the dawn light filtering through the bomb bay. "You really think this tin wall of yours can take what's coming?" the pilot, Lieutenant Harris, asked over the intercom. Frank smiled. "Only one way to find out." They climbed to 20,000 feet. Frost crept across the windows. The horizon ahead flickered with distant flashes, flak bursts blooming like black flowers. "Bandits inbound," came the radio call. Then the attack began. Dozens of FW-190s and Me-109s tore into the formation, their cannon shells streaking like white-hot needles. The air erupted with chaos, planes spiraling, engines burning, men screaming over the radio. Frank's twin 50s roared to life. The recoil hammered his shoulders, the smell of cordite mixing with cold oxygen. He tracked a fighter slicing toward them at 2 o'clock low and fired a perfect burst. The German plane exploded in a flash of orange and smoke. "Good hit, Dillard," Harris shouted. But then came the sound he'd learned to dread, a deep whump that shook the plane's belly. Flak hit. A shell tore through the fuselage just aft of Frank's position. Shrapnel screamed through the compartment, slamming into the armor plates he and Rudy had welded. The steel rang like a church bell, the vibration shaking his teeth. When the smoke cleared, he looked down. The plates were cratered, splintered, but intact. The blast had been deflected away from the crew. Without them, the waist section would have been gutted. "Waist check," the pilot called. Frank keyed his mic. "We're good. Still in one piece." He looked across the compartment at Rudy, who grinned back through soot and sweat. "Guess the brass can shove their memos, huh?" As they pushed deeper toward Augsburg, the Luftwaffe regrouped. 4 enemy fighters came in from behind, their tracers slicing past the tail. The tail gunner shouted, "I'm hit! Controls jammed!" Frank swung his guns around, firing short, controlled bursts. 1 fighter caught fire and dove out of formation, but 2 more stayed on them. He could see the faces of the German pilots now, cold, determined, professional. A cannon shell detonated inches from his armor plate. The blast lifted him off his feet. When he landed, he realized something impossible. He was alive. The armor had cracked, but held again. He looked down and saw a deep dent right where his chest would have been. "Rudy," he shouted, "check the plates!" Rudy crawled over and thumped them with his fist. "Still solid," the radio crackled. "Bombers, prepare for run." Frank steadied himself. The formation reformed through smoke and fire, limping toward the target. Below them, the ball-bearing plant came into view, massive, gray, sprawling like a fortress. Bomb bay doors opened. The sky filled with falling steel. Seconds later, the ground erupted in fire and debris. They turned for home, half the formation missing, but Lucky Lady still flying. When they landed, ground crews counted 187 holes in her fuselage. The waist armor had absorbed the worst of it. The engineers couldn't believe it. One of them shook his head and said, "If this had been standard issue, half the 8th Air Force would still be alive." Frank didn't say anything. He just climbed down from the hatch, brushed the soot from his jacket, and looked at the sunset spreading across the English sky. For the first time in a long time, he felt what victory actually sounded like. Silence, not screaming. He'd done what the manual said was impossible. He'd made a flying coffin into a fortress again. 2 weeks after the Augsburg mission, Frank Dillard received a letter with an official seal, not from his base, not from his squadron, but from Washington, D.C. It was marked confidential. Engineering Command. Air Technical Service. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sentence that would change everything. Report to Wright Field, Ohio, for technical debriefing on experimental B-17 armor modification, effective immediately. Frank stared at it for a full minute before Rudy smacked him on the shoulder. Well, well, looks like the brass finally wants to know how the outlaw does it. They caught a transport across the Atlantic, a noisy C-54 filled with returning officers, wounded airmen, and crates of classified parts. Frank had never been farther west than Missouri before the war. Now he was going home a legend, and a problem. At Wright Field, he expected punishment. Instead, they treated him like a scientist. Engineers crowded around him, notebooks open, pencils scratching furiously. His patchwork drawings, once mocked, were now pinned on a corkboard labeled Field Installed Armor System, Unauthorized. A colonel asked, "How'd you design this?" Frank shrugged. "Didn't design it, just paid attention to where men died." The colonel didn't flinch. "That's how most good ideas start." They showed him data, photos, cross-sections, ballistic test results. They'd already built prototypes based on his work. "You realize your fix increased waste gunner survival rates by 38%, another engineer said. "That's the largest jump in crew survivability since we added self-sealing fuel tanks." Frank stared, speechless. His field repair, made out of desperation and scrap, had just rewritten the survival math of the air war. The Army wanted to make it official, standardized, mass-produced, and installed on all new B-17 models. But bureaucracy still moved slower than flak bursts. Committees debated weight limits, aerodynamics, and cost efficiency. A general finally cut through the noise. "Gentlemen, I don't care what it costs. It saves men. We'll make it fit." They called the program Project Hardshell. Within 2 months, the first factory-modified Dillard plates were installed on new flying fortresses rolling out of Seattle and Long Beach. Crews who'd never met Frank began writing thank-you letters addressed simply to "the guy who saved my life." But recognition brought attention and scrutiny. A major from logistics pulled him aside one afternoon. "Between us, Sergeant, you'll never get credit for this. The brass can't admit a gunner did what the engineers missed." Frank just smiled. "Don't care who gets credit. I just don't want to see empty bunks." Still, his story spread. Stars and Stripes ran a piece titled, "Field Fix Saves Crews Over Europe." They didn't print his name, just the legend. When his commanding officer back in England read the article, he sent a telegram that said, "We heard the whole base cheered when they saw your plates in print. Not bad for a guy who welded junk on government property." For the first time since he joined the Army, Frank laughed without bitterness. He toured the factories next, rows of women and men riveting the new armor to fresh bombers. He walked the assembly line, running his hand along the cold steel. Each rivet, each plate, each weld was another small promise that someone else might come home alive. One young woman, her hands black with grease, looked up at him and said, "Sir, they say you made these?" He nodded quietly. "No, ma'am, I just started them. You're the one finishing the job." The moment stayed with him, because in that vast, roaring hangar filled with the rhythm of production, Frank finally understood. He hadn't just changed a plane. He'd changed how America fought. Not through orders, but through conviction. Not through power, but through care. And in a war that turned men into machines, he'd proved that one man's will could still change the math of survival. By the summer of 1944, Dillard's armor was no longer a rumor passed among ground crews. It was standard equipment. Every B-17 that rolled off an American assembly line bore the unmistakable marks of his field-borne idea: reinforced waist panels, angled deflectors, and better protected gunner stations. Across England, waist gunners began calling it the Shield. It was superstition, maybe, but in war, names meant power. Men believed in the steel that stood between them and the grave. Frank returned to the 351st Bomb Group a changed man. He was still a gunner, still one among thousands, but the crews treated him differently now. Even the officers gave him a quiet nod when he passed. The first mission he flew after his return proved the point. Over Bremen, their formation took brutal fire. The plane next to Lucky Lady was hit hard. Flak burst beneath her belly, ripping through the midsection. Smoke poured out. Frank braced for the familiar chaos of screams and falling metal. But then came something he'd never heard before: laughter. The waist gunner of that crippled B-17, alive and unhurt, shouted over the radio, "Tell Dillard his plates work." When they landed, Frank walked across the field and saw the damage up close. The armor was scorched, dented, even warped, but intact. Behind it, the gunner's station was untouched. "Couldn't even feel the blast," the man said, patting the steel affectionately. Frank just nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, B-17 losses began to fall. Some credited improved escort tactics, others the relentless bombing strategy. But among the crews, the truth was simpler. The armor saved us. That phrase became as common as the bomber's nickname, the Flying Fortress. Letters began arriving from across the Atlantic. Pilots, mechanics, even generals writing to thank him. One from a Major Reed: "Before, we sent our boys out knowing the odds. Now, for the first time, those odds are shifting back our way. You didn't just make the fortress stronger. You gave us hope." It wasn't glory Frank wanted, but the words hit him hard. He'd spent years counting holes, tallying deaths, fighting arithmetic with scraps of steel. And somehow he'd changed the math. When victory came in 1945, he returned home quietly. No medals, no parade, just a discharge form stamped honorable and a duffel bag of memories too heavy to unpack. He went back to Missouri, took a job repairing tractors, and tried not to think about the sound of flak. But one morning, while flipping through a newspaper, he froze. A headline read, "Dillard Armor Standard on all new B-17G models." The article was short, no photo, no quote. Just a mention that field innovations from veteran gunners have inspired improvements in aircraft survivability. It was bureaucratic language, stripped of emotion. But to Frank, it was enough. He kept that clipping folded in his wallet until the day he died. Years later, at a veterans reunion, a much younger gunner approached him. "Sir," he said, "my dad flew B-17s in '45. He said the armor saved his life twice. I just wanted to say, thank you." Frank shook the young man's hand. "Don't thank me. Thank the boys who kept flying even when the sky was on fire." That night, under the reunion tent, surrounded by men who'd once faced death together, he finally allowed himself to exhale. Because he'd learned something the war never taught in manuals. That true strength doesn't come from orders or steel. It comes from the stubborn will of people who refuse to let others die when there's a way to save them. That will had turned the B-17 from a symbol of endurance into a testament to human ingenuity. And though history would call it the Flying Fortress, the men who lived to tell the tale knew better. It wasn't the fortress that saved them. It was the man who built the walls. Decades after the war, the roar of the B-17s was gone. Airfields once packed with fortresses had become museums, their runways silent, but for the wind. Yet somewhere in the heart of Texas, at an air show under a cloudless blue sky, one flying fortress still rumbled to life. It was Sentimental Journey, a restored B-17G gleaming with polished aluminum, and faded nose art. Crowds gathered as the engines coughed, then thundered into a steady rhythm. Among the onlookers stood an old man with silver hair, leaning on a cane. His name tag read F. Dillard, waist gunner, 351st BG. A young pilot guiding the visitors noticed him. "You flew these?" Frank nodded slowly. "A long time ago. She used to sound louder." The pilot smiled. "They all say that. The old birds are quieter now. Peace makes better echoes than war." Frank chuckled softly. "Back then, we didn't care about peace. We cared about getting home." The pilot gestured toward the waist window, the very place where Frank's idea had been born. "You know, this one's fitted with the early D-model armor plates. Originals. They say a gunner came up with them in the field. Some sergeant who didn't follow orders." Frank's gaze lingered on the riveted steel, worn and pitted with age. He said nothing. "Whoever he was," the pilot continued, "he saved a lot of lives." Frank just nodded, eyes glinting. "Yeah, he tried to." As the crowd dispersed and the B-17's engines faded, Frank sat alone beneath the wing, running his weathered hand across the cool metal. In its reflection, he didn't see a soldier or a hero, just a mechanic who refused to let bad math decide who lived and who didn't. He thought of Tommy Greer, the young waist gunner from Kansas City, of Rudy, who'd welded with him in the dark, of all the men who never saw their homes again. Their ghosts seemed to hum in the engine's idle rhythm, steady, faithful, unbroken. A boy from the crowd wandered up. "Mister, were you in the war?" Frank smiled. "Yeah, I fixed planes." The boy pointed to the steel panel. "Did you make that?" Frank paused, then nodded once. "Yeah, I guess I did." The boy's eyes widened. "Then you saved people." Frank's smile faded into something quieter, deeper. "No, we saved each other. That's what people do when everything else is gone." He looked toward the horizon. The Texas sun bled gold across the wings, the same color it had been over England so many years ago. The same light he'd seen after every mission, every loss, every impossible morning. When the announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome America's flying fortress, symbol of courage and endurance." The crowd cheered. But Frank only heard the echo of gunfire and the thud of shells against steel. To them, it was a relic. To him, it was a promise kept. He stood slowly, patted the aluminum skin of the bomber, and whispered, "You kept flying. That's all I ever wanted." Years later, when historians catalogued the innovations of World War II, Dillard's armor appeared as a brief line in a technical manual. Field-developed reinforcement, standardized 1944. Significantly reduced waist gunner casualties. No medals, no speeches, just facts. But among those who'd flown and fought, his name lived on in hangar whispers and reunions. Every waist gunner who touched that cold steel before takeoff, every crewman who came home because of it, they knew. Frank Dillard never called himself a hero. He wasn't trying to change history. He was just trying to change one flight, one mission, one chance. And in doing so, he'd changed the sky itself. Because in war, not all heroes pull triggers. Some pick up a wrench and refuse to let others fall.